A millionaire pays a homeless woman to have a baby, but when the kid is born, he's totally shocked by what he sees. Before we dive into the story, drop a comment below telling us what city you're tuning in from. Enjoy the ride. Meet Harry Langston, a 40-year-old guy who's got it all: cash, power, and a high status. But that night, he realized that for all his riches, there was one thing he couldn't buy: an heir. He really wanted a kid. Harry wasn't looking for a typical family setup. He'd been through 2 marriages, and both ended in disaster and heartache. He figured love was just a fairy tale that brought nothing but trouble. But a kid, that was different. It was more like an investment, a way to keep his legacy alive. So, he decided he wasn't going to bother with the relationship for this. He wanted a clear-cut agreement, no messy feelings involved, just a contract. With his resources, he knew he could find someone willing to carry a baby without any emotional strings attached. For Harry, this was just business, and he planned to keep it that way. The next morning, Harry zoomed around the city in his flashy sports car, but his mind was all about finding someone to take up his offer. While he was waiting at a light downtown, something caught his eye. There was a young woman sitting on the sidewalk, sketching on a piece of grimy paper. She had messy brown hair hanging in her face, but her blue eyes sparkled with something. Even though she looked worn out, she seemed invisible to everyone else, but for some reason, Harry couldn't shake her from his mind. He tried to ignore her, but when the light turned green, he glanced back and thought, "Who sits drawing on the sidewalk like there's nothing else going on?" Annoyed with himself, he sped off. But a few blocks later, he felt a nagging feeling. He pulled into a parking lot and stared at the steering wheel, wrestling with his thoughts. Then it hit him. "This is crazy," he muttered, but something inside him urged him to go back. So he turned the car around and headed back to where he'd seen her. She was still there, now propping her drawing against the wall. He parked by the curb, rolled down the window, and spoke in a cold, commanding tone. "Hey, you, come here." The young woman eyed him with suspicion, narrowing her gaze as she sized up the well-dressed guy in the sports car. She hesitated. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice low but firm. Harry studied her for a moment before answering. "Get in. We need to talk." She let out a dry laugh. "I'm not one of those, if that's what you're hinting at." He frowned, clearly annoyed by the assumption. "Don't be ridiculous. I'm not here for that. I just want to talk. Get in the car or keep sitting on that sidewalk." There was still some hesitation, but his authoritative tone left her little choice. Finally, she opened the door and climbed in. The silence in the car was thick, but Harry didn't seem bothered. He drove them to a quiet cafe, away from all the city chaos, and parked. "What's your name?" he asked as they settled at a corner table. "Leah Parker." "But why does that matter?" she shot back, still eyeing him suspiciously. "Because I need to know who I'm dealing with." "So, Leah, why do you sit on the sidewalk drawing like nothing else matters?" She shrugged, avoiding his gaze. "What else is there to do? I've got nowhere to go. I lost everything, but that's not your problem." He leaned in closer, resting his elbows on the table. "Okay, let's get straight to it. I've got an offer for you, something that could change your life." Her eyes narrowed. "And what's that?" "I want you to have a baby for me." Leah blinked, clearly caught off guard. "You're kidding, right?" "Nope, I'm serious. I'll cover all your expenses, support you during the pregnancy, and when it's all done, you'll get a sum that'll set you up for life." She let out a nervous laugh, crossing her arms. "This has to be a joke. What kind of guy makes that kind of offer to a total stranger?" "The kind of guy who knows what he wants and isn't into wasting time. Look, I don't want a relationship, Leah. I'm not looking for emotional drama, just a kid. It's as simple as that." Leah stared at Harry like he'd just lost it. His words kept ringing in her ears. I want you to have my child." As much as she wanted to brush off his crazy proposal, there was something in Harry's eyes that made it clear he was dead serious. His cold logic hit her hard, leaving her feeling stuck between keeping her dignity and facing the tough reality of her life. "This is insane," Leah finally said, breaking the silence. No woman in her right mind would agree to this. But Harry didn't flinch. Keeping his usual cool demeanor, he shot back, "No woman in your situation would turn this down. I'm offering you a way out, comfort, stability, and a fresh start in exchange for something you already have, the ability to have a child." Leah crossed her arms, trying to act tough, but deep down she knew he was right. Every day was a struggle just to get by. Still, the idea of trading something so personal for money made her stomach turn. "And then what?" she asked, her voice heavy with doubt. "What happens after the baby is born?" Harry relaxed a bit in his chair, like he'd been waiting for this question. "After the baby arrives, you'll get a good chunk of cash to kickstart your life, no strings attached. You'll be free to do whatever you want." "No strings attached?" She let out a dry laugh. "And how do I know you won't change your mind and drag me to court later?" He studied her for a moment before replying, "Layla, I'm a businessman. I don't make deals without making sure everyone wins. You'll have a legally binding contract. Neither of us can change the terms once it's signed." Layla fell quiet, taking in his words. The idea of some security, even if just for a bit, was tempting. She had nothing right now, not even a place to crash that night, but she also knew she was about to make a life-changing decision. "And what if I say no?" she pressed, leaning in a bit. Harry gave a slight smile. "Then you go back to the streets. You keep scraping by, dealing with the cold and hunger. The choice is yours." His words hit hard. She wanted to hate him for being so blunt, but she hated the truth in them even more. He had her backed into a corner, and she knew it. But there was one more thing she had to ask. "Why are you doing this?" she demanded. "A guy like you with all your money. Why not adopt a kid or find one of those rich women who love to show off their perfect children?" Harry took a deep breath before answering, his tone more serious. "Because I want something that's mine, an heir of my own blood. And dealing with adoption or getting tangled up with someone from my social circle brings complications I'm not interested in. I want control, Layla. Nothing more, nothing less." The coldness in his words made her look away, feeling unsettled. She knew he was being honest, which only made her feel more vulnerable. "I need some time to think," she finally said, trying to regain a bit of control. Harry nodded as if he'd expected this. "You've got 24 hours. After that, don't bother reaching out." He stood up and walked toward the door without another word. Layla watched him leave, feeling like she was getting pulled into a whirlwind she might never escape. Walking through the streets, Layla's mind raced. Harry's words echoed in her head: comfort, stability, a new life. She knew all too well what it meant to have nothing. The biting cold of the night stung her skin, reminding her that tomorrow would bring the same struggles: the fight for food, the constant fear, and the humiliation of being invisible to the world. She sat on a park bench, staring at the overcast sky. Her mom used to say that opportunities only knock once, and it's up to you to decide whether to grab them or let them slip away. But at what cost, she wondered. Having a kid, even as part of a deal, was a huge decision. But what if it was her only shot at escaping the endless cycle of misery? Meanwhile, Harry sat in his living room, looking over a contract his lawyers had put together. He hated waiting, but he knew Layla didn't have many options. Still, he'd already calculated the risks. If she said no, he'd just move on to someone else. Easy as that. The sound of the intercom broke his thoughts. He picked up, hearing his receptionist say that Layla had arrived. "Send her up," he replied, keeping his tone neutral. Minutes later, the door opened and Layla walked in. Her eyes looked tired but determined. "I accept," she said straight up before Harry could say anything. He stood up, studying her closely. There was no hesitation on her face, just a firm decision. "Great. Let's make this official." He motioned for her to sit while he grabbed the contract from the table. Layla glanced at the document, reading the terms carefully. It was all laid out. She'd be taken care of during the pregnancy, with all her expenses covered, and in the end, she'd get a nice sum to restart her life. In return, she'd give up any rights to the child. "This seems final," she murmured as she read. "That's exactly what I want," Harry said, "and I hope it's what you want too." Layla took a deep breath, hesitated for a moment, and then picked up the pen. With a quick motion, she signed her name, sealing a deal that would change everything for her. Signing that contract was more than just a transaction. It was the start of a whole new chapter in Layla Parker's life. Later that day, Stephanie, Harry's assistant, escorted her to a black car parked at the entrance of the building. As Layla looked out the window, the city, which had once felt so overwhelming, now seemed to offer something different. A chance to start fresh. She didn't say much during the ride to Harry's mansion, but Stephanie tried to lighten the mood. "You'll love the place. It's quiet, spacious, and super comfy." Her friendly tone felt like a stark contrast to the cold business vibe of the contract she had just signed. Layla just nodded, still trying to wrap her head around everything that had happened in the last few hours. When they finally arrived at the mansion, Layla's eyes widened. The massive iron gate swung open to reveal a property with perfectly kept gardens. The mansion itself was an impressive marble and glass structure that felt just as cold and calculating as its owner. Stephanie led her inside, and Layla barely had time to take in the fancy details: crystal chandeliers, grand marble staircases, and furniture that looked like it belonged in a magazine. It made her uneasy. This wasn't her world, but for now it was her new reality. "I'll show you to your room," Stephanie said with a smile. "It's one of the best suites in the house." Layla followed her in silence. When they entered the room, she was greeted by a huge bed with soft linen sheets, floor-to-ceiling windows, and a bathroom bigger than any apartment she had ever lived in. "If you need anything, just call me. We're here to take care of you," Stephanie added before leaving her alone. Layla sat on the edge of the bed, running her hands over the soft sheets. It felt strange. Just yesterday, she had been sleeping on cold sidewalks, and now she was surrounded by luxury. But even with all that comfort, there was still a heaviness in the air. She knew she wasn't just a guest, she was part of a business arrangement. In the days that followed, Layla tried to get used to the new routine. Meals were served on time, and a team of doctors was brought in for initial exams. As expected, Harry kept his distance, focused on work, and rarely showed up around the house except to check on the reports Stephanie gave him about Layla's progress. On one of those rare occasions, they bumped into each other in the hallway. Layla was leaving a medical appointment when she saw Harry striding toward her, looking as composed as ever. "Are you okay?" he asked, his tone sounding more like a formality than genuine concern. Layla paused before responding. "Everything's as expected, I guess." He nodded but didn't push for more conversation. However, before walking away, he gave her one last look. "If you need anything, ask Stephanie. I want you to be well." She wasn't sure how to take that. Was it real kindness or just a way to keep things running smoothly? Either way, that brief encounter stuck with her. Even though she was being treated like royalty, Layla couldn't shake the dilemmas that started creeping in. One quiet night, she stepped out onto the balcony and gazed at the vast garden bathed in moonlight. Everything felt so calm, so far removed from her old life. "Am I doing the right thing?" she wondered, hugging herself against the chilly breeze. The thought of carrying a child and then giving it away felt increasingly complicated. The contract made it clear she wouldn't have any rights to the child, but she worried about how she would handle the emotional fallout. Meanwhile, Harry watched her from afar. He knew Layla was tough, but he could see she was carrying a lot of emotional baggage. Despite his cool exterior, he found himself a bit curious about her. Who was this woman who had accepted such an unusual offer? And why couldn't he shake the feeling that maybe she was more than just part of a plan? One evening, Layla was in the living room flipping through a book from the shelf. She wasn't really into classic literature, but there was something cozy about the quiet house and the smell of old books. Harry walked in and caught her by surprise. He looked distracted, holding a stack of documents. "I didn't expect to find you here," he said, stopping in the middle of the room. "I didn't expect you to talk to me," she shot back with a smirk. He frowned but didn't say anything right away. Instead, he set the folder down on the table and plopped into a nearby armchair. "Are you settling in?" he asked, arms crossed. "I think so," she replied hesitantly. "But it still feels weird. It doesn't feel real." Harry leaned forward a bit. "It doesn't have to feel real. This is a contract, Layla. An agreement. I promise you everything will go exactly as planned." "That's what you do, right?" she said a bit defiantly. "Plan everything, calculate everything, leave no room for mistakes." He studied her for a moment, weighing whether to keep the conversation going. "That's how I've built everything I have. Planning prevents failure," he finally said. Layla let out a short laugh, shaking her head. "Sometimes failure is unavoidable. You can plan all you want, but you can't control how you feel, Harry." Her words hit him hard. He leaned back in the chair, not saying anything. Layla noticed his reaction but didn't push it. She just picked up the book from the shelf and headed to her room, leaving Harry alone with his thoughts. As the days passed, Layla began to settle into life in Harry Langston's mansion. While the surroundings were grand and comfortable, she still felt like she didn't quite belong. Every expensive piece of furniture and decorative item seemed to scream that this wasn't her place. Still, she kept following the routine, frequent doctor visits, meals made by chefs. Despite all the comfort, an emotional emptiness lingered. At night, when she was alone in her room, she thought about what she'd left behind. Not that it was much, but it was the only life she'd known. Now everything felt chaotic. What would it be like to carry a child and then hand it over? She tried to push those thoughts away, but they haunted her, especially in the quiet of the night. While Layla wrestled with her inner struggles, Harry observed her from a distance. He kept his reserved demeanor, but his curiosity about her grew. Even while juggling meetings and commitments, he found himself thinking about her often. It wasn't romantic or emotional, at least not yet, but it was a curiosity he couldn't quite explain. One afternoon, after a long day of meetings, Harry came home and found Layla chilling in the garden. She was perched on a bench, gazing up at the sky. It was a stark contrast to the tough image he had of her. For a second, he thought about not approaching her, but he ended up walking over anyway. "Enjoying the garden?" he asked in his usual straightforward way. Layla turned a bit, surprised, but quickly replied, "It's nice. Definitely better than the streets." He sat down next to her, keeping some space between them. There was something refreshing about Layla's honesty. "Are you settling in?" he asked. Layla shrugged, staring at the flowers. "It still feels weird, like I'm living someone else's life." Harry fell silent for a moment before saying, "It's all part of the deal. I want you to have everything you need so things go smoothly." "As planned," she repeated with a hint of sarcasm. "Do you always plan every second of your life?" Harry raised an eyebrow, caught off guard by her question. He was used to people just going along with what he said, never challenging him. "Planning is what keeps everything running," he said firmly. "Without it, everything falls apart." Layla gave a faint smile and shook her head. I don't think everything can be controlled. Sometimes things just happen, whether you like it or not." Her words threw him off more than he expected. He stood up suddenly, cutting the conversation short. "If you need anything, let Stephanie know," he said before heading back inside. A few days later, Harry decided to tag along with Lila to one of her doctor's appointments. He told himself it was to make sure everything was going well, but deep down he felt a growing responsibility for the whole situation. Lila didn't seem surprised but was curious about why he came. At the doctor's office, they went through the usual tests, and for the first time, they heard the baby's heartbeat. Lila felt a wave of unexpected emotion wash over her. Her eyes teared up, but she tried to hide it. Harry, on the other hand, stayed still, his face hard to read. But something in his eyes had shifted. It was like that simple sound had touched something inside him he wasn't ready to confront. "Everything looks perfect," the doctor said with a smile. "You can start thinking about what you want to do next, like prenatal care and the next steps." Lila nodded, but Harry stayed quiet. On the drive back to the mansion, the silence felt heavy. Harry seemed deep in thought, and Lila couldn't figure out what to say to break the tension. When they finally arrived, he opened the door for her, a simple gesture that caught her off guard. "Thanks for today," Lila said as she stepped out of the car. "It was the least I could do," Harry replied, not meeting her gaze. "I'll make sure everything goes smoothly." Lila watched him walk into the mansion, his posture always so proper. But there was something different about him. Maybe the heartbeat had touched a side of Harry he usually kept hidden. Or maybe she was just imagining things. In the days that followed, Lila started to notice small changes. Harry was around more often in the common areas, and their conversations, though still brief, felt less robotic. He began asking about her appointments and how she was feeling, even suggesting activities to help her unwind. One night, while they were having dinner in silence at the big table, Harry broke the routine and asked, "Have you thought about what you want to do after all this is over?" Lila was taken aback by the question. It was the first time he'd shown any real interest in her future. "I don't have any plans," she admitted. "I still don't know what my life will look like after this." Harry nodded, seeming to really think about her answer. "You'll have the resources to start fresh wherever you want. Just make sure you do something worthwhile." Lila looked at him, intrigued. Beneath his cold, calculated exterior, there seemed to be a hint of genuine concern. She wasn't sure how to read it, but for the first time, she didn't feel completely alone in the mansion. One morning, Lila found a package left at her room's entrance. It was a beautifully wrapped gift with a little handwritten note, "To help with your free time." Inside was a new sketchbook and some high-quality pencils. Lila was totally at a loss for words. She had no idea Harry even knew about her love for drawing. During one of their earlier chats, she had casually mentioned how she used to draw to keep herself busy, but she never thought he'd remember it, let alone care. That night, while she was hanging out in the garden, Harry walked by and stopped for a second. "Did you like the gift?" he asked, sounding pretty chill. "Yeah," Lila said, holding up the sketchbook. "Thanks. I didn't see this coming." Harry shrugged. "I figured it might be good for you." Lila smiled, gripping the sketchbook a little tighter. "It was," she said simply. Lila started to realize that even though the mansion was nice and all, it didn't really help her deal with her inner conflicts. Each day felt a bit empty, like she was there but not really present. Harry seemed to keep his usual tough exterior, but she sensed there was more to him that he kept hidden. One morning, she was caught off guard by a surprising request from Harry. He wanted to chat after breakfast, which felt unusual since he usually kept his distance. Once they were done eating, Lila found him in the sitting room next to a pile of papers. "I want to go over some extra details of the contract," he said straight up. Lila's heart raced, thinking he was about to throw new conditions at her. "More details?" "I thought we had everything sorted," she replied, trying to mask her nerves. Harry watched her for a moment before going on. "It's nothing that changes the terms. I just want to make sure you understand how things will be after the baby comes. I want to avoid any surprises." Lila took a deep breath to calm herself. "I think I get it. I'll leave and you'll carry on with your life." He nodded slightly. "Yeah, but I want you to know that if you need anything after, no matter what the agreement says, I'm here to help. I don't want you to feel alone." She raised an eyebrow, surprised by his offer. His tone felt different, like he was actually trying to show some care that hadn't been there before. "That's unexpected coming from you," she said, unable to hide her sarcasm. Harry just shrugged. "I don't want complications, and this is the best way to avoid them." Lila chuckled, but something about his seriousness made her rethink her sarcasm. Maybe he really was trying to be different, even if he wasn't quite sure how. Later that day, Lila decided to check out more of the mansion. It was massive, with endless hallways and rooms filled with artwork that probably cost a fortune. As she wandered around, she stumbled upon a small study at the end of a hallway. The door was slightly open, so she peeked inside. Harry was sitting at the desk, but he didn't look like he was working. He was holding a framed photo and staring at it. Lila couldn't see what it was, but something about his posture caught her eye. She knocked softly on the door, and he quickly set the photo down. "Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt," she said hesitantly. Harry looked up, clearly surprised to see her. "It's nothing," he replied, slipping back into his neutral mood. "Did you need something?" "No, I was just exploring the house," Lila said, hesitating. "You looked like you were deep in thought." Harry was silent for a moment before saying, "We all have things we'd rather keep to ourselves." Sensing he didn't want to dive deeper into that topic, she switched gears. "This place is huge. Do you live here all alone?" He nodded, crossing his arms. "It's more practical than it seems. I don't like distractions, and here I have the space I need." Lila studied him, trying to comprehend how someone could live in such luxury and still feel so lonely. "That must be weird," she said without thinking. "Having all this but no one to share it with." Harry looked away, clearly uncomfortable. "I'm used to it. I don't need anyone to do what I do." Lila wanted to believe him, but there was something in his tone that suggested otherwise. Before she could say anything, Harry stood up. "If you need anything, Stephanie can help," he said, wrapping up the conversation. That night, Lila went out to the terrace. The sky was clear, and the city lights sparkled in the distance. Sitting there, she let her mind wander. She thought about the sound of the baby's heartbeat she'd heard during the checkup, a sound that affected her more than she could explain. As much as she tried to keep her emotions in check, it was getting harder. When she heard footsteps behind her, Lila turned to see Harry. He looked tired, but still held that same stiff posture. "You like this spot, don't you?" he asked as he approached. "I like the silence," she answered. "It helps me think." He stopped beside her, gazing at the city lights for a moment before speaking. "Thinking isn't always a good thing." Lila laughed, but it didn't have much humor in it. "Try telling that to someone who spends most of their time alone." Harry didn't respond right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer. "Sometimes being surrounded by people doesn't help much either." Lila glanced at him and noticed a sadness in his words she hadn't heard before. "Maybe you need something you can't control, Harry," she said, not holding back. She didn't regret it. He frowned as if he wanted to say something but decided against it. Instead, he turned and walked away, leaving Lila with her own thoughts. In the weeks that followed, Lila realized that no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't keep a solid wall between herself and Harry. He stayed mysterious, but there were moments when bits of his true self slipped through. And while she tried to keep her distance, Something inside her wanted to understand the man who had brought her into this situation. Meanwhile, Harry was dealing with feelings he couldn't quite put a name to. He had gone into this agreement expecting it to be simple and under control, but now he was starting to see it was way more complicated than that. Lila wasn't just a part of a plan, and that scared him. The following week, it was time for another checkup. Lila woke up early, feeling a mix of nerves and excitement. Time was flying by faster than she thought, and just the idea of seeing the babies for the first time, even if it was just on a screen, made her heart race. She wondered if Harry would be there for this appointment like he was last time. When she came down for breakfast, she found Stephanie going over the schedule with Harry. "Ready?" Harry asked, looking up from a folder of documents. "Ready enough," Lila replied, trying to sound calmer than she felt. "Great. We'll go together." He didn't say much more, but his tone made it clear there wasn't room for discussion. Lila headed to the car, feeling the silence between them heavier than usual. Harry was focused as always, but there was something different about him. Maybe he was as nervous as she was, though he would never admit it. At the doctor's office, the physician greeted them with a warm smile and motioned for Lila to lie down while he got the ultrasound equipment ready. "Today we'll get a clearer view of the baby," the doctor explained, adjusting the monitor. Lila looked at the screen, trying to ignore the cold gel the doctor was spreading on her belly. When the transducer started gliding over her skin, she held her breath, anxious about what was coming. Harry stood beside her, arms crossed, eyes glued to the monitor. Then they heard it, the strong, steady rhythm of heartbeats. Not just one, but two. "Well, here's the surprise we couldn't see last time," the doctor said, pointing to the screen. "You're expecting twins." Lila's eyes widened in shock. Twins? She had never even thought about that possibility. A wave of emotion washed over her, a mix of surprise and joy. Instinctively, she placed a hand on her belly, trying to wrap her head around the news. Harry, for his part, stayed silent for a few seconds, his serious expression shifting to something Lila had never seen before. Genuine awe. "Two?" he asked, needing confirmation. "Two," the doctor replied with a smile. "Both seem healthy and are growing well." The silence that followed was filled only with the sound of heartbeats echoing in the room. For Lila, that moment was magical. No matter how hard she tried to keep her emotions in check, she felt deeply connected to the two lives inside her. Harry, standing beside her, seemed equally moved. He stayed quiet, but his eyes showed a depth of feeling that words couldn't express. On the way back to the mansion, the silence between them felt different. It wasn't the usual cold and distant silence, but something meaningful. Lila finally broke the quiet. "You don't seem like the kind of person who gets easily surprised," she said, trying to lighten the mood. Harry sighed, keeping his eyes on the road. "I'm not. But this..." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "This is different." Lila glanced at him, intrigued. Harry rarely showed emotions, but now he seemed lost in thought. "Is it scary?" she asked softly. He turned slightly to look at her. "Number, it's impressive knowing that in a few months, two completely new beings will be here, depending on me." Lila felt a pang in her chest. She knew she would eventually have to let go of those babies. But hearing him talk about them with such care made her realize how connected she already was to them. "They depend on me too, at least for now," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. Harry nodded. "I know. And that's why I want to make sure you're okay, Lila. Not just physically, but in every way. That's important to me." She stayed silent, soaking in his words. It was the first time he had spoken so sincerely about what they were going through. Later that night, Lila was on the terrace looking at the horizon when Harry came out. He seemed hesitant, which was rare for him. "I can't stop thinking about what the doctor said today," he started, sitting next to her. "Two babies. 2 futures. Lila turned to him, surprised by his openness. It's a lot of responsibility, isn't it? It's more than that, Harry said, staring out at the horizon. This is the first time I feel like something in my life can't be calculated. I can't plan who these 2 will become. I can't control who they'll grow into. Lila felt a chill at his words. It was rare for Harry to admit that something was out of his control. She realized that, like her, he was changing, even if he didn't want to. Sometimes that can be a good thing, she said, not knowing what's next. It can bring things you never imagined. Harry looked at her, considering her words. For the first time, he seemed to be accepting that not everything in life could be planned. It was a small gesture, but it meant something. Later, as she sipped tea in the living room, Harry quietly sat in the armchair opposite her. He seemed more relaxed than usual, although he still had that serious vibe. "Did you like what I left in your room?" he asked bluntly. "Yes, I did." "It was thoughtful of you," Lila replied, studying him curiously. "Good. I want to make sure you're comfortable." "That's important to me," he said without breaking eye contact. Lila frowned slightly. As much as she appreciated his kindness, there was still a barrier of mistrust she couldn't shake off. "You're changing, Harry, or at least it seems that way." "But I still don't know why," she said directly. He stared at her for a moment as if deciding what to say. Finally, he sighed. "Maybe you're right. Maybe I am changing. But honestly, I don't know how to be different. I'm not used to caring." The words seemed to surprise both of them. It was rare to see Harry admit any vulnerability, but there he was, opening up in a way he never did before. That night, Lila reflected on their conversation while gazing at the sky from the terrace. Harry wasn't what she had expected. He was still hard to read, but there was something human beneath that controlling exterior. She just didn't know if that was a good or bad thing. Meanwhile, Harry was in his office, staring at the contract that defined his arrangement with Lila. For the first time, he felt the weight of that document. He had started this with a clear goal, to have an heir and move on with his life. But now, things weren't so simple. He knew he was starting to care, and that scared him. The next morning, Harry joined Lila for breakfast, which was unusual for him. "There's something I'd like to talk about," he said directly. Lila looked up, curious. "What is it?" He hesitated before answering. "I know you still don't trust me, and I can't blame you. I've never been good at trusting people, and that's turned me into someone who can be pretty hard to deal with." Lila stayed silent, letting him continue. "I've been through some stuff that taught me not to rely on anyone and to keep my distance so I wouldn't get hurt. But with you and what we're building, I'm starting to think I might be wrong about that." She blinked, surprised by how honest he was being. It was rare for Harry to open up like this. "We all have our walls, Harry," she said softly, "but that doesn't mean we have to hide behind them forever." He nodded, really thinking about what she said. "Maybe you're right, but changing isn't easy for me." Lila smiled a little. No one said it would be. Later that day, Harry decided to join her for a walk in the garden. They started off chatting about small things, but soon the talk shifted back to the babies. "Have you thought about names?" he asked, catching her off guard. "No, not yet. I figured that was something you'd want to decide on your own," she replied. "I think it'd be fair to do it together," he said. Lila was amazed. Harry was really trying to be more open and present. She was still a bit cautious, but she couldn't ignore that he was making an effort. As the sun set, they sat on a bench in the garden, taking in the warm colors of the sky. "I never thought I'd be here doing something like this," Lila said, almost to herself. "Neither did I," Harry said with a slight smile. "But maybe this is exactly where we need to be." Lila looked at him and noticed that for the first time, he seemed to be letting his guard down. Maybe, Just maybe this wasn't just a contract, but the start of something much bigger. The next morning was like any other. Lila felt the weight of the pregnancy in every move, but she was determined to stick to her routine. Harry was at the office, buried in paperwork as usual. Their interactions had become a sort of quiet comfort for both of them. But that day felt different. Just before lunch, Lila felt a sudden pain. It was unlike anything she had felt before. She tried to brush it off, thinking it was just another pregnancy ache, but it got worse. Concerned, she called Stephanie, who immediately sensed something was off. "Harry needs to know about this," Stephanie said, helping Lila sit down. "This could be the start of labor." Lila nodded, trying to breathe through the pain as another wave hit her. Stephanie went to get Harry, and he showed up in minutes. When he saw her, his usual calm demeanor was replaced by genuine concern. "Lila, what's happening?" he asked, rushing over. "I think it's happening," she gasped. "The babies are coming." For a moment, Harry seemed frozen, but then he sprang into action. He grabbed the phone and ordered the driver to get the car ready, while telling Stephanie to gather everything they'd need for the hospital. "We're going now," he said, his voice urgent but steady. The ride to the hospital was a whirlwind of emotions. Lila focused on managing the pain, while Harry sat next to her, watching her with anxiety and determination. He held her hand during the trip, a gesture that felt automatic but meant a lot. "We're almost there," he said, squeezing her hand gently. "You'll be okay. We'll be okay." Lila didn't respond, but she felt a strange calm from his words. At the hospital, everything moved fast. A medical team was ready, thanks to Harry's planning, and Lila was taken straight to the delivery room. He stayed by her side the whole time, refusing to leave even when the staff tried to get him to wait outside. "I'm staying," he said firmly, holding her hand. "I'm not going anywhere." During the hours that followed, Harry witnessed something he never expected: Lila's strength as she brought their twins into the world. Each moment felt endless but was filled with intensity he had never known. Finally, the first cry echoed in the room. "A boy," the doctor announced with a smile. Harry's heart raced as he watched the baby being placed on a nearby table. Before he could fully process it, another cry filled the air. "A girl," the doctor said. Lila, exhausted but with shining eyes, looked at the two babies being gently cleaned and wrapped in blankets. She wanted to hold them, but she knew the moment would be fleeting. Harry stood frozen for a few seconds, watching the doctor work. Then, as if something inside him finally broke open, he stepped closer to Lila, took her hand and said, "You were incredible. Thank you." Silent tears rolled down Lila's face, but she couldn't tell if they were from joy, relief, or a heart that was starting to break. Soon after, the babies were handed to her. Lila held them carefully, feeling their warmth and fragility. She studied them, taking in every detail, their closed eyes, tiny fingers moving. It was an overwhelming love, and she knew she couldn't leave them without carrying a piece of them with her, forever. Harry stayed by her side, silent but clearly moved. When he finally held the boy in his arms, his tough exterior softened in a way Lila had never seen before. He seemed to connect,